The machine stopped while the weather was perfect. Marcus Webb had been watching the yield monitor climb since dawn, the numbers glowing steady in the September light. 187 bushels per acre, then 192, then 189, and for the first time in 4 years, he had allowed himself to think about profit instead of survival. The corn stood thick and golden across 240 acres outside Oskaloosa, Iowa, and the forecast showed clear skies until Monday, maybe Tuesday if the front stalled. He had checked twice that morning before climbing into the cab of the John Deere 8370R, a machine he had bought 3 years earlier for $380,000, when the insurance money from Judith's medical bills finally stopped bleeding his accounts dry. The combine had cost more than his house, more than his first 100 acres, more than every vehicle he had ever owned combined. But Judith had been gone 6 months when he signed the papers, and the old harvester had thrown a rod in the middle of October, and the dealer had looked at him with that expression men get when they see a widower making decisions alone. Marcus had written the check because farming does not pause for grief, and because he had promised Judith he would keep the land for their daughter Carolyn, and because the only way to keep that promise was to harvest crops and pay taxes and not let the farm slip through his fingers the way everything else seemed to be slipping. Now the screen in front of him flickered. The numbers vanished. The header slowed, and the engine note changed, not failing but disengaging, pulling back from the work it had been built to perform. Marcus lifted his foot from the pedal. The combine drifted to a stop in the middle of the row, surrounded by corn that was ready, and weather that was right, and time that was running out. The silence inside a stopped machine during harvest is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of consequence. Every minute the header sits still is money not earned, crop not secured, promises not kept. The display rebooted. White text appeared against the black screen, clinical and final. Unauthorized modification detected. Remote operational restrictions applied. Contact authorized John Deere service representative. Marcus read the words 3 times. His wedding ring caught the morning light as his hand gripped the armrest. 14 years of marriage reduced to a band of gold he could not bring himself to remove. Judith would have known what to do. She had always known what to do when systems tried to squeeze them, when bureaucracies stacked rules like walls, when the world decided that small operations did not matter enough to accommodate. She would have made phone calls in that voice she used when she was done being polite, the one that turned customer service representatives into allies and loan officers into reasonable human beings. But Judith had been dead since March of 2022, and Marcus had been making decisions alone ever since, and none of those decisions had prepared him for this. He climbed down from the cab. The cornfield stretched in every direction, stalks rustling in a breeze too gentle to matter. His phone showed 7:58 in the morning. The wallpaper was a photo of Carolyn in her graduation gown, cap tilted slightly, crooked smile bright against the backdrop of Iowa State's Campanile. She had been 20 when Judith died. Now she was 24 and working as a data analyst in Des Moines, and Marcus saw her maybe twice a month when guilt or duty pulled her back to the farm for Sunday dinners that neither of them knew how to fill with conversation. He walked back to this pickup truck parked at the field's edge, a 2018 F-150 with 140,000 miles and a dent in the passenger door from the time Judith had backed into the grain bin during planting season. She had laughed about it for weeks. Marcus opened the door and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. The manila folder rested on the passenger seat where it always rested, thick with papers he had accumulated over 3 years of careful record-keeping. Documentation, Judith had called it. Proof, she had said, for when they try to take advantage. He pulled out his phone and dialed the John Deere dealer in Ottawa, 43 miles northeast. The call connected after 2 rings. A voice answered with professional cheer, the kind that comes from scripts and training rather than genuine interest in solving problems. Marcus explained the situation. The combine had stopped. The screen showed an unauthorized modification message. He needed someone to come out and clear the restrictions so he could finish his harvest. The voice on the other end of the line became cautious. Yes, the system had flagged the machine. Yes, there was a record of unauthorized software modification detected by the remote monitoring system. Yes, the restriction would remain in place until an authorized technician could inspect the equipment and verify system integrity. Marcus asked the question that mattered. When can someone come out? The answer arrived without hesitation, practiced and unapologetic. 12 to 14 days, sir. We have a backlog of service calls during harvest season. I can schedule you for September 28th. That's the earliest available appointment. Marcus looked out the windshield at the field. The corn was at 18.5% moisture, perfect for combining. The forecast showed a cold front arriving late Sunday with rain that could last 3 days. If the crop sat through wet weather, moisture would climb and quality would drop and profit margins would evaporate. He had maybe 3 days to finish 240 acres, and the dealer was telling him to wait 2 weeks. I have maybe 3 days before the weather turns. Can you get someone here sooner? I understand that's difficult, sir. Unfortunately, our technicians are fully booked. Harvest is our busiest season. If I can't harvest this week, I could lose $40,000 in revenue. I'm sorry to hear that, sir. I wish I could help, but there's nothing I can do about the schedule. Your appointment is confirmed for September 28th at 10 a.m. Marcus ended the call. He sat in the truck with the phone in his hand and the folder on the seat beside him, and the combine visible through the windshield, $380,000 of green and yellow steel rendered useless by lines of code written by engineers who had never stood in a field and watched weather approach. The machine he had paid for was not fully his. It had never been fully his. The purchase agreement included software licensing terms he had skimmed and accepted because that was the only way to buy equipment now, and somewhere in those terms was language that gave the company the right to disable machines remotely if unauthorized repairs were detected. The unauthorized repair had happened in June. A sensor fault had been throwing error codes since planting season, interrupting field work and costing him hours of productivity. He had called the dealer the first week of June. 8 weeks for an appointment, they said. He called again in mid-June. 10 weeks now, they said the schedule had filled up. He called a third time in late June, and the answer was the same. Harvest does not wait for service appointments. Crops ripen according to weather and biology, not corporate calendars. So Marcus had driven the combine to Knoxville, 47 miles west, and let an independent mechanic named Frank Galloway look at the problem. Frank was 63 and had been fixing farm equipment since before John Deere started installing computers in tractors. He diagnosed the sensor issue in 45 minutes. Faulty moisture sensor common problem on the 8370R series replacement part cost $90, and the labor added another $250. Total bill was $340. The dealer's estimate had been $1,200 and an 8-week wait. The combine had run perfectly from June through August, and Marcus had assumed the issue was resolved. But the machine had been reporting back to the company the entire time, sending telemetry data through the cellular connection built into its systems, and somewhere in those transmissions, the repair had been detected and flagged and filed away until the moment when enforcement would cause maximum disruption. He opened the folder to the first page. Judith's photograph was tucked inside a plastic sleeve protected from oil and dirt and the wear of constant handling. She looked younger than she had been when she died, the picture taken during a Farm Bureau meeting maybe 10 years earlier. Her smile was genuine but restrained the expression of someone who knew cameras were performance and preferred authenticity to presentation. Marcus touched the plastic with his thumb. 4 years had not made missing her easier. Time had only made the missing more familiar, a constant weight he had learned to carry without staggering. The folder contained 3 years of records. 14 separate interactions with the John Deere dealer. 6 occurred during planting season, 5 during harvest. Average wait time for service appointments was 47 days, a number Marcus had calculated in the margins of a page because numbers gave him something to control when nothing else could be controlled. Estimates from the authorized dealer averaged 3.4 times higher than quotes from independent mechanics for identical work. 2 warranty claims had been denied initially, then reversed after third-party technicians confirmed the failures were covered defects. Every page represented a moment when Marcus had been told to wait, to pay more, to accept less, to trust systems that did not trust him. The house was quiet when he walked through the door an hour later. It had been quiet since Judith died, a silence that expanded to fill every room and corner until Marcus could go entire days without speaking aloud except to answer phone calls or place orders at the feed mill. He made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Judith had taught him to keep records, where she had explained that documentation was not about paranoia but about self-respect. If you let them take advantage without writing it down, she had said, you lose arguments, you should win. He drank the coffee cold. The clock on the wall showed 11:47. Outside, the combine sat motionless in the field, visible through the window like an accusation. He thought about calling the dealer again. He thought about driving to Ottawa and demanding to speak to a manager. Instead, he sat at the table and did nothing, because nothing felt like the only option available. The sound of a car in the driveway pulled him from stillness. He was not expecting anyone. Ray Sullivan sometimes drove over unannounced, but Ray would have called first, this close to his own harvest. Marcus walked to the front window and looked out. A silver Honda Accord sat behind his truck, and Carolyn was climbing out of the driver's seat. She had driven 90 minutes from Des Moines without calling. That meant she had seen his missed call from that morning and known something was wrong. Marcus opened the door before she reached it. They stood facing each other for a moment, father and daughter separated by 4 years of grief they had never properly shared, and then Carolyn stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. He held her carefully, surprised by the contact. Physical affection had become rare between them, replaced by polite distance and conversations about weather and work that never touched anything real. "Dad, what happened?" "Equipment trouble. Nothing you need to worry about." Carolyn stepped back and looked at him with the expression she had inherited from her mother, the one that said she could see through deflection and would not tolerate being managed like a child. "Dad, I know your everything's falling apart face. What happened?" He told her about the combine, the restriction message, the dealer's response, the weather window closing. She listened without interrupting, her jaw tightening the way Judith's used to tighten when systems revealed themselves to be less about helping people and more about protecting bureaucracy. When he finished, Carolyn walked to the kitchen and sat down at the table. The manila folder was there, same as always. She pulled it toward her and started flipping through pages. "You've been tracking this for 3 years. Your mother said to write things down." Carolyn turned pages, scanning dates and notes and invoice copies. Her eyes moved quickly, processing information the way she had been trained to process data in her job, analyzing trends for an insurance company. Marcus watched her read his grief, because that was what the folder contained beneath the service records and cost estimates. Every entry was a conversation with Judith, a way of keeping her present in decisions she could no longer influence. "Dad, this isn't just record keeping. This is evidence of a pattern. I just wanted to remember what they said, so they couldn't change their story later." Carolyn looked up from the folder and her eyes were wet. Marcus realized he had not seen her cry since the funeral. She had been strong then, composed in a way that seemed unnatural for a 20-year-old losing her mother, and he had been grateful because one of them needed to hold together while everything fell apart. But strength without release is just grief deferred, and he understood now that she had been deferring for 4 years, the same way he had been deferring, both of them isolated in separate versions of the same loss. Mom also said to ask for help. "Do you remember that? She said asking for help isn't weakness. I can handle this. That's what scared people say, Dad, not what strong people say." The words landed like stones. Marcus felt something crack inside his chest, some structure he had built to keep functioning through years of solitary farming and empty evenings and holidays spent pretending he was fine. Carolyn was right. He had been scared. Scared of looking weak. Scared of admitting he could not manage everything alone. Scared that if he stopped moving and asked for help, he would discover there was no help available, and he would collapse under the weight of that knowledge. "I'm tired, Carol, and I don't think I can save this on my own." Then we don't do it alone." She reached across the table and took his hand, and Marcus felt the distance between them close for the first time since Judith died. They had been orbiting each other for 4 years, careful and remote, unable to share their grief because sharing meant acknowledging it, and acknowledgement meant feeling it fully instead of keeping it manageable through avoidance. But Carolyn was here now, and she had driven 90 minutes because she knew he was in trouble, and maybe that meant something could be rebuilt between them, even if Judith could not be brought back. "What do we do?" Carolyn picked up her phone and opened the camera app. "We tell people what happened. Not to complain, to stand up. I don't want to make this public. Dad, this is already public. The second they locked your machine remotely, it became public. We're just making it visible." Marcus shook his head. He was 52 years old and had spent his entire life avoiding attention, doing his work quietly and expecting fairness without demanding it. The idea of recording himself and posting the recording online felt performative, desperate, like admitting he had lost control so completely that public pressure was his only remaining tool. "Your mom used to say something. Do you remember? The only thing worse than speaking up and failing is never speaking up at all." The words hit him with the force of memory. Judith had said that during a dispute with the Farm Service Agency, when bureaucrats tried to deny them a loan modification they were entitled to receive. She had made phone calls and written letters and shown up at offices until the decision was reversed, and afterwards she had told Marcus that silence in the face of wrong is just another kind of defeat. He had forgotten. Or maybe he had not forgotten but had chosen not to remember because remembering meant acting, and acting meant risking failure. "Okay, we record something, but I don't know what to say. Just tell the truth. That's all you need." They walked back out to the field together. The combine sat exactly where Marcus had left it hours earlier, a monument to promises broken and systems indifferent to human need. Carolyn held her phone horizontally, framing the machine in the shot. Marcus stood beside the cab, one hand resting on metal that was still warm from the morning sun. He felt exposed, standing there vulnerable in a way that farming had never made him feel, even during the worst droughts and lowest grain prices. Farming was hard, but it was honest. This felt like begging. "Whenever you're ready, Dad." Marcus looked at the camera. He thought about Judith and the promises he had made at her bedside when the hospice nurses said there was nothing more they could do. He thought about Carolyn and the distance between them that this moment might begin to close. He thought about the 240 acres waiting to be harvested, and the rain coming, and the dealer who would not arrive for 12 more days. "My name is Marcus Webb. I lost my wife Judith 4 years ago to cancer. Before she died, I promised her I would keep this farm for our daughter Carolyn." His voice was steadier than he expected. The words came without rehearsal, pulled from the same place where grief lived alongside determination. "This is a John Deere 8370R combine. I paid $380,000 for it 3 years ago. This morning it stopped working in the middle of my field. Not because of a mechanical failure, because the company detected that I had a sensor repaired by an independent mechanic in June. They locked the machine remotely. I called the dealer and asked when someone could come out to unlock it. They said 12 to 14 days. I have maybe 3 days before rain comes. I have 240 acres of corn ready to harvest. And I cannot use the machine I paid for because a company decided that keeping their service monopoly matters more than letting farmers work during the narrow windows that weather allows." He paused. Carolyn kept the camera steady, her face expressionless, but her eyes encouraging him to continue. "I'm not angry at John Deere. I'm just a 52-year-old man who kept his word to his dying wife, and now I can't finish what I promised her because a system values control over fairness." His voice cracked slightly on the last words. Carolyn lowered the phone and walked over and hugged him again, and this time Marcus let himself hold her tightly, let himself feel the weight of 4 years pressing down on both of them. When they separated, she checked the video length, 4 minutes and 12 seconds. She watched it once, then looked at him. "Dad, this is powerful. People need to see this." What people? Everyone who's ever been told to wait while their livelihood disappears. Everyone who's been locked out of something they paid for. Everyone who kept a promise when it was hard. She uploaded the video to a Facebook group called Iowa Corn and Soybean Farmers, a community of 4,200 members that Marcus had joined years earlier but rarely engaged with beyond reading weather discussions and equipment reviews. The caption was simple: "Need advice." Anyone dealt with this? Carolyn set her phone on the kitchen table and made sandwiches. Neither of them ate. Marcus sat across from her, feeling strange and unmoored, like he had crossed some threshold without fully understanding what lay on the other side. The phone buzzed, then again, then continuously, a rhythm of notifications that did not stop. Carolyn picked it up and started reading. 40 views already. People are commenting. What are they saying? That this happened to them too? That they've been waiting weeks for service during planting? That they've been charged 3 times what independent shops charge? Dad, they're sharing it. Marcus did not know what to do with that information. He had expected maybe a dozen farmers to leave sympathetic comments and offer suggestions that would not solve anything. He had not expected the video to move beyond the group, to be shared into other farming communities and then into networks that had nothing to do with agriculture. But Carolyn was scrolling now, her expression shifting from curious to surprised to something close to awe. 400 views. No, wait. 4,000. Dad, this is spreading. Who's sharing it? Not just farmers. Look at this comment. It's from someone named Barbara in Iowa. She says her husband died 3 years ago, and she understands keeping promises. And this one from a retired teacher in Minnesota. She says this is what integrity looks like. The numbers kept climbing. By the time Marcus finished his coffee, the video had been viewed 40,000 times. The comments were no longer just farmers sharing equipment horror stories. People were talking about loved ones they had lost, about promises they had tried to keep, about systems that demanded compliance without offering support. The story had become larger than a locked combine. It had become about grief and determination, and the gap between what institutions claimed to value and what they actually protected. Carolyn created a spreadsheet on her laptop, tracking similar stories as they appeared in the comments. Farmers from Wisconsin and Minnesota and Missouri describing identical delays and lockouts and price gouging. But also widows and widowers talking about handling farms alone after spouses died. Parents discussing the pressure of maintaining family businesses through loss. The video was reaching people who had never driven a tractor, people who saw in Marcus's situation a reflection of their own struggles against systems that measured efficiency in dollars rather than dignity in human terms. Dad, this isn't just about your combine anymore. What is it about keeping promises when you're alone? Standing up when it feels impossible, refusing to be invisible. Marcus looked at the view count. 180,000. The number seemed incomprehensible. He had posted a 4-minute video from a cornfield in Iowa, and now nearly 200,000 people had watched him talk about his dead wife and his daughter and a machine that would not work. The attention made him uncomfortable. He was not a person who sought visibility. He preferred the quiet satisfaction of work completed and promises kept without witnesses or applause. The sound of another vehicle in the driveway interrupted his thoughts. Marcus walked to the window. Ray Sullivan's truck sat behind Carolyn's car, and Ray was climbing out with a casserole dish wrapped in aluminum foil. Claire had sent food, which meant Ray had told her what was happening, which meant word was spreading through the county the old-fashioned way, even as it spread through the internet in ways Marcus barely understood. Ray knocked once and walked in without waiting for an answer. He was 58, white-haired and solid, a military veteran who had returned to farming after 20 years in the Army and never talked about the places he had been or the things he had seen. He set the casserole on the counter and turned to look at Marcus. Claire figured you probably haven't eaten anything worth eating today. Tell her thank you. Ray pulled out his phone and opened Facebook. He found the video without searching, already visible on his feed, because multiple people he knew had shared it. He watched in silence, his expression neutral, in the way of men who had learned to keep reactions internal until they decided what those reactions should be. When the video ended, he looked at Marcus. "How many views now?" 180,000. Maybe more. Ray sat down at the table and studied the manila folder that still lay open where Carolyn had left it. He paged through the records, slowly reading Marcus's notes and studying the pattern they revealed. When he finished, he closed the folder and rested his hand on it. "I've known you since Judith died. This is the first time you've asked for help, even if you didn't mean to." "I didn't ask. Carolyn made me record that. You asked by recording it. You asked by posting it. You asked by admitting you can't handle this alone. That's what asking looks like." Marcus wanted to argue, but found no argument available. Ray was right. The video was a request for help dressed in the language of documentation and complaint, and the response had been overwhelming in ways Marcus had not anticipated. People were offering legal advice and media contacts and expressions of solidarity that felt both comforting and disorienting. He was no longer alone in the situation, even though he was still alone in his kitchen with a daughter he barely knew how to talk to, and a neighbor who had been too kind for too long without receiving much kindness in return. What do I do now? You let this move. You don't try to control it. You just stay honest and see where it goes. The view count passed 500,000 by evening. Carolyn tracked the spread across platforms, watching the video migrate from Facebook to Twitter to Reddit to news aggregator sites that picked up stories with emotional weight and regional specificity. The narrative had shifted from man versus machine to man versus system, and beneath that, to widower keeping promise to dying wife. People responded to the human elements more than the agricultural policy implications. They shared the video not because they cared about right to repair legislation, but because they recognized grief and determination and the particular loneliness that comes from handling impossible situations without support. A comment appeared from someone named Dylan Cross. Marcus did not recognize the name, but Carolyn pulled up the profile. Farmer from Illinois, 41 years old, 600 acres of corn and soybeans. The comment was simple and direct. "I'm driving my tractor to John Deere Regional Office in Moline Friday morning, 9 a.m. Anyone joining me is welcome." The replies accumulated quickly. Farmers from Iowa and Wisconsin and Minnesota saying they would be there. The word convoy appeared. The idea took shape in real time, a spontaneous gathering organized around shared frustration and the desire to make visibility into pressure. Carolyn showed Marcus the thread. He read it twice, trying to understand what he had set in motion. He had wanted his combine unlocked. Now people were planning to drive tractors across state lines to demonstrate outside a corporate office, and his name was attached to the movement, and he did not know how to feel about being the center of something he had never intended to create. "Dad, people want to help. Let them. I don't want to be responsible for other people losing time during harvest." "You're not responsible. They're choosing, just like you chose to record that video." The phone rang. Marcus looked at the number. Des Moines Register. He let it go to voicemail. Then another call from a Minneapolis area code. Then Chicago. The media had found the story attracted by the combination of viral momentum and heartland imagery and the timeless appeal of underdog narratives. Marcus turned off the phone. He was not ready to talk to reporters, not ready to explain himself to strangers, not ready to become a symbol for causes he barely understood. Carolyn's phone buzzed. She read the message and looked up. "Catherine Holloway wants to talk to you. She's an attorney with Farm Bureau, specializes in agricultural equipment disputes. I don't need a lawyer. I need my combine unlocked." "Dad, maybe those two things are connected now." The view count reached 800,000 by the time Marcus went to bed. He lay in the dark, listening to the house settle the familiar creaks and sighs of a structure built in 1947 that had sheltered 3 generations of farmers and would outlast him if he could keep paying taxes and avoid foreclosure. Judith's side of the bed remained empty, the sheets still fitted and pillows still arranged the way she had liked them. He had not changed anything in the bedroom since she died. Changing felt like erasing, and he was not ready to erase, even though 4 years should have been long enough to begin letting go. He thought about the video, about Carolyn's face when she realized people were responding not just to agricultural policy, but to the story of a father keeping a promise to a mother who was gone. About Ray's quiet observation that asking for help sometimes looks like admitting you cannot handle everything alone. About the view count climbing while he sat in his kitchen watching numbers replace isolation with something he did not yet have words to describe. He thought about Judith and the folder she had started and the wisdom she had tried to pass on when she knew she was running out of time to teach him how to survive without her. The documentation was not about paranoia or distrust. It was about proving that what happened to you actually happened, that the patterns you perceived were real and not imagined, that standing up required evidence, and evidence required attention, and attention required being willing to be seen even when being seen felt dangerous. Judith had understood that. She had built the framework knowing Marcus would need it someday, knowing he would struggle alone until something forced him to ask for help, knowing the ask would feel impossible until he understood it was the only option remaining. He reached for his phone in the darkness and turned it back on. 47 missed calls, 236 unread messages. The video had crossed 1 million views. Marcus Webb had spent 4 years being invisible, and now he could not hide even if he wanted to. And the strange thing was that somewhere beneath the discomfort and fear, he felt something else, something that might have been relief. He was not alone anymore. The problem was not solved. The combine was not unlocked. The rain was still coming. But he was not alone, and maybe that was enough to keep going. Wednesday morning arrived with frost on the windshield and Marcus sitting at the kitchen table staring at Judith's photograph. He had not slept more than 90 minutes the rest of the night, spent watching the view count climb past 1.2 million, while his phone accumulated messages he did not know how to answer. The sun rose pale and distant over fields that should have been half finished by now, and the weight of attention felt heavier than the weight of isolation had ever been. Carolyn emerged from her old bedroom at 6:15, already dressed, her laptop under one arm and determination written across features that resembled her mother's more each year. She poured coffee without speaking and sat across from him with the familiarity of someone who had decided that distance was no longer acceptable. The silence between them was different now, not the careful avoidance of the past 4 years, but the shared quiet of people preparing for something neither fully understood. "Dad, you've been sitting here an hour." "I know. What are you thinking about? Whether I'm making a mistake? Whether this makes things worse instead of better?" Carolyn opened her laptop and turned the screen toward him. The video had been shared by agricultural news sites, rural advocacy groups, grief support communities. Comments continued accumulating, thousands of them now, stories layering upon stories, until the original post had become a collection point for every farmer who had waded through harvest delays, and every widow who had tried to keep businesses running alone, and every person who had discovered that ownership in the modern era came with invisible restrictions. Worse than being silenced, worse than accepting that systems can lock what you paid for. Marcus looked at the screen without focusing on any particular comment. The volume of response was overwhelming, transforming his specific complaint into something larger and more diffuse, a symbol for grievances he had never intended to represent. "I'm not good at this. Public things. Your mom handled interactions like this?" Carolyn reached across the table and took his hand, her grip firm in a way that reminded him of Judith during the final weeks when she had held on to consciousness through sheer force of will. "Then I'll help you," the way she would have. The first reporter arrived at 9:40. A woman in her 50s from the Des Moines Register, professional but not aggressive, carrying a camera and notebook, and an expression that suggested she understood rural life better than most journalists who covered agriculture from distant newsrooms. Marcus froze when he saw the car pull into the driveway. His instinct was to not answer the door, to let the moment pass without engaging, to retreat into the privacy that had protected him for 4 years. But Carolyn was already walking to meet the reporter, introducing herself with the easy confidence of someone who worked in corporate environments and knew how to navigate conversations with strangers. Jenny Caldwell, I spoke with your father yesterday and left a message. He's been dealing with a lot of calls. I'm Carolyn Webb, his daughter. I appreciate you taking the time. I know harvest is critical right now. They walked back to the house together, and Marcus watched through the window as his daughter handled the preliminaries, explaining the situation in clear terms that avoided both victimhood and melodrama. By the time they reached the door, Jenny was nodding with the understanding of someone who had covered enough farm stories to recognize when genuine hardship was being presented without exaggeration. Marcus stepped outside rather than inviting them in a boundary that felt important, even if he could not articulate why. Mr. Webb, thank you for speaking with me. I've watched your video several times. Can you walk me through what happened? Marcus explained the sensor repair in June, the dealer's refusal to schedule service for 8 weeks, Frank Galloway's diagnostic work, and the $340 fix. He described the restriction message appearing Tuesday morning and the 12 to 14-day wait time quoted by the Ottawa dealer. Jenny took notes without interrupting her questions, coming only after he finished, focused on verification rather than interpretation. How many acres do you still need to harvest? 240. And the weather forecast? Rain late Sunday, possibly Monday, maybe 3 days of wet weather after that. If the crop sits through it, moisture climbs and quality drops. I lose money on every bushel. Have you had other delays with authorized service in the past? Marcus thought about the manila folder, the 14 documented interactions spanning 3 years. He thought about telling her the pattern, the average 47-day wait during critical seasons, the cost differential between dealer estimates and independent mechanics. But Carolyn spoke before he could answer. My father has kept detailed records for 3 years. Every service call, every delay, every cost comparison. Would you like to see them? Jenny's expression shifted from professional interest to genuine curiosity. She followed Carolyn inside while Marcus remained on the porch, uncomfortable with the idea of journalists examining documents that felt private, even though they were business records. Through the window, he watched Carolyn open the folder and spread pages across the table, explaining the pattern in language borrowed from her data analysis work, translating his handwritten notes into quantifiable trends that supported claims of systematic neglect rather than isolated incidents. When Jenny emerged 20 minutes later, her notebook was full, and her perspective had clearly evolved. She set up her camera beside the combine for photographs, positioning Marcus against the machine in ways that emphasized scale and stillness. The images would run with tomorrow's story, she explained, and the article would explore not just his individual situation, but the broader pattern of service delays affecting small farming operations across the Midwest. Mr. Webb, one more question. Do you feel like John Deere is punishing you for choosing independent repair? Marcus considered the question carefully. Punishment implied intent, malice, a desire to harm, rather than simply a system protecting its interests without regard for the collateral damage. I feel like a system that can lock equipment remotely should have equal urgency unlocking it when harvest windows are narrow. That's all. Jenny wrote the quote down verbatim, underlining it twice. She thanked them both and drove away, leaving Marcus standing beside the combine with Carolyn and the weight of having been documented by someone whose job was to make private struggles public. The convoy discussion had grown overnight. Dylan Cross's original comment had spawned a dedicated Facebook group with 580 members by Wednesday afternoon. Farmers were posting photos of tractors being loaded onto trailers, planning routes to Moline, coordinating arrival times and parking logistics. The organization happened spontaneously through crowd consensus rather than top-down planning, a self-assembling demonstration driven by shared frustration and the viral momentum of Marcus's video. Carolyn showed him updates throughout the day. A Wisconsin farmer was leaving at midnight Thursday with 12 tractors in convoy. Minnesota group had 8 machines confirmed. Illinois locals were bringing 20 because the regional office was essentially home territory. Missouri farmers were driving 8 hours to participate. The total count approached 70 tractors, far exceeding Dylan's original expectations, and the scope kept expanding as more people saw the video and recognized their own experiences in Marcus's description of systematic delays. "Dad, people are taking time away from their own harvests to do this. I know. I feel responsible. You're not responsible. They're choosing. They're choosing because someone finally said out loud what they've been thinking privately for years." Marcus understood the logic but could not fully accept it. His discomfort with being the focal point remained constant, even as the movement built momentum around him. He had spent 4 years avoiding attention, and now attention found him everywhere. Local television stations requested interviews. Agricultural advocacy organizations wanted statements. Dylan Cross called asking permission to use Marcus's name in promotional materials for the Moline gathering, and Marcus said yes because saying no felt like abandoning people who were supporting him, but the yes came reluctantly. Carolyn was monitoring responses when her posture changed, spine straightening in the way it did when something significant required immediate attention. She stared at her laptop screen for nearly a minute before speaking. "Dad, you need to see this." She turned the computer toward him. An email sat open, subject line simple and direct. "For Carolyn, from Mom." The sender address was Carolyn's own Gmail account. The message had been scheduled using a delayed send feature programmed years earlier to deliver on a specific date or after specific conditions were met. Marcus did not understand the technology, but he understood the intention. Judith had written something for their daughter and arranged for it to arrive at a moment when Carolyn would need it most. How did this just arrive now? Carolyn's voice was barely controlled. She had opened the email thinking it was spam or a technical glitch, and instead found words written by her mother during the final months of illness, preserved through automated systems, and delivered precisely when grief and determination intersected. "I set up an auto-response once that saved drafts. Mom must have figured out how to schedule it. I don't know when she wrote this or how she knew when I'd need it." She scrolled to reveal the message. "Carolyn, if you're reading this, I'm gone and your dad is struggling. I know you've been strong. I know you've tried to give him space to grieve. But space becomes distance, and distance becomes isolation, and isolation is what I'm most afraid of for him. He'll try to do everything alone because that's what men are taught to do when they're hurt. He'll push you away without meaning to because letting you help means admitting he's not handling things as well as he needs to. But I need you to know something. The records I taught him to keep aren't just farming documentation. They're proof he mattered, that he stood for something when systems tried to dismiss him, that he didn't let the world push him around without writing down what happened. Someday something will feel impossible to handle alone, and he'll think he has to anyway. That's when I need you to step in. Help him even if he says he doesn't need it. Make him see that admitting you can't do everything yourself is strength, not weakness. Don't let him disappear, Carolyn. Don't let him become so quiet that people forget he's there. I love you both more than I can write. Mom. P.S. Check the folder one more time. I left something else." Carolyn was crying before she finished reading aloud. Marcus felt his chest tighten, emotion rising too quickly to contain or redirect. Judith had known. 4 years before the combine locked and the video went viral and the convoy organized, she had known that Marcus would try to handle impossible situations alone, and she had prepared her daughter to intervene. The letter was not coincidence. It was strategy, a final act of protection delivered through technology and timing. "She knew I'd try to do this by myself. She knew you'd try to do everything by yourself. That's why she taught you to document. So when you finally needed help, you'd have proof worth sharing." The P.S. pulled Marcus back to the present. He walked to the filing cabinet and retrieved the manila folder, flipping through pages he had examined countless times, looking for something he had missed. Tucked against the back cover was a sealed envelope, plain white, no markings except 3 words in Judith's handwriting, "For Marcus after." His hands trembled opening it. The letter inside was dated March 2022, written during the final week when hospice nurses began preparing him for the inevitability he kept trying to postpone through denial and desperate hope. My dearest Marcus, you made it through a harvest without me. I'm proud of you, even though I won't be there to say it. I know you've been alone. I know you've tried to be strong for Carolyn. I know you've probably pushed people away because that's what you do when you're hurt and don't know how else to protect yourself. But the records I taught you aren't just about protecting yourself from dealers and banks. They're about proving your life mattered, that you stood up when standing up was hard, that you kept your word even when keeping it cost you something. Someday you'll face something that feels impossible to handle alone. You'll think you have to handle it anyway because asking for help feels like admitting defeat. But I need you to understand the strongest thing you can do isn't carrying everything yourself. It's admitting you can't and letting people love you enough to help anyway. Let Carolyn help. Let Ray help. Let people see that you need them because needing people is what makes us human instead of just surviving. I love you forever. Take care of our girl. Take care of yourself. Judith Marcus read the letter 3 times before his vision blurred too much to continue. Carolyn stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder, both of them processing the fact that Judith had orchestrated this moment years in advance. She had known Marcus would need permission to accept help, so she had given that permission in writing. She had known Carolyn would need encouragement to push past her father's defenses, so she had provided that encouragement through automated delivery. The letters were not sentimental gestures. They were tools precision-engineered to crack open the isolation both father and daughter had built around themselves. She planned this, all of it, not the combine locking, but she knew something would happen that you couldn't fix alone, and she made sure we'd both know what to do when it did. They sat at the table for a long time, not speaking, the letters between them like artifacts from someone who understood the future better than the people living in it. Eventually, Carolyn made food neither of them wanted, and Ray called to check on them, and the view count kept climbing toward numbers that stopped meaning anything, except that visibility had replaced privacy whether Marcus wanted it to or not. Thursday morning brought more calls. Catherine Holloway from Farm Bureau Legal Services left a detailed voicemail explaining her background in agricultural equipment disputes and class action litigation. Marcus listened to the message twice before returning the call, reluctant, but recognizing that Judith's letter had been explicit about accepting help, even when it felt uncomfortable. Catherine's voice was professional, but carried undertones of personal understanding that transcended client-attorney formality. Mr. Webb, I've reviewed the documentation your daughter sent. What you have isn't a single service dispute. It's evidence of systematic practice. I just want my combine unlocked so I can finish harvest. I understand. But if we handle this correctly, you help yourself and 200 other farmers with identical problems. That's what the data shows. 214 farmers have contacted me since your video went viral, all with similar delays, lockouts, and cost differentials. Marcus absorbed the number. 214 farmers meant 214 families affected by the same pattern he had documented, and the pattern stopped being coincidence when it repeated across state lines and dealer networks and multiple growing seasons. Catherine continued outlining the framework for a class action complaint that would cite his records as evidence of intentional service monopolization designed to protect dealer revenue rather than serve customer needs. What do you need from me? Permission to include your documentation in a formal filing, and your willingness to be identified as lead plaintiff if this moves to litigation. The word litigation triggered Marcus's instinct to withdraw. He was not a person who sued companies or challenged systems through courts. He fixed what was broken quietly and moved on, accepting that some fights were not worth the energy they required. But Judith's letter was fresh in his mind. Her insistence that standing up mattered more than staying comfortable. And Carolyn was watching him with an expression that said she would support whatever he decided, but hoped he would choose action over retreat. Okay, use the records. I'll be lead plaintiff if that helps other people. Catherine's tone shifted, relief audible beneath the professional composure. Thank you, Mr. Webb. I lost my husband to a farm accident 10 years ago. I know what it means to keep going when every part of you wants to quit. Your wife taught you well with those records. Now let's honor that by making them count for something bigger than one harvest. Dylan Cross updated the convoy plans Thursday afternoon. The Moline gathering had evolved from casual protest to organized demonstration with designated parking areas, media liaison volunteers, and explicit rules against blocking traffic or engaging in confrontational behavior. The emphasis was on quiet presence rather than loud demands. 67 tractors arranged in orderly rows to create visual impact without chaos. Dylan had coordinated with local police to ensure the gathering stayed legal and peaceful, transforming spontaneous anger into structured advocacy. Marcus and Carolyn packed for the drive to Illinois Thursday evening. Carolyn insisted on bringing Judith's photograph, the same one from the folder, arguing that her mother was part of this story, whether or not she was physically present. Marcus did not argue. The photograph went into Carolyn's bag along with copies of the documentation Catherine needed and clothes for 2 days away from the farm. Ray and Claire Sullivan arrived at 7 with enough casserole and baked goods to feed everyone who might gather at the farmhouse. Claire was 55, white-haired, and direct-to-farm wife who had spent 3 decades managing household finances and community relationships, while Ray handled field work and equipment maintenance. She hugged Carolyn with the maternal warmth Marcus could no longer provide, and when she hugged Marcus, the embrace lasted longer than necessary, communicating support that words would have made awkward. "You're not doing this alone anymore. You know that, right?" Marcus nodded because speaking would have required composing himself, and he was not composed. Claire set food containers on the counter with the efficiency of someone who had been bringing meals to neighbors in crisis for decades, and Marcus understood that this was how rural communities functioned. You did not wait for people to ask for help. You showed up with food and presents, and the assumption that help was needed whether or not it was requested. Claire had been organizing through channels Marcus did not fully understand, making phone calls and sending messages to farm wives across 4 counties. 15 women were planning to attend the Moline gathering, wives of farmers who had experienced the same service delays and cost inflations Marcus had documented. They would bring coffee and chairs and the kind of quiet support that transformed protests into community gatherings. Claire explained this matter-of-factly, as if mobilizing a network of farm women was simply what one did when systems revealed themselves to be indifferent to the people they claimed to serve. "We're not angry protesters. We're families who are tired of being ignored. There's a difference." Carolyn bonded with Claire, immediately drawn to the older woman's combination of pragmatism and warmth. They talked about documentation strategies and social media amplification, while Marcus and Ray loaded supplies into the truck, and Marcus watched his daughter connect with someone who represented the kind of community support Judith had built, but he had let atrophy through 4 years of isolation. The women's network Claire was assembling operated on principles Judith would have recognized: practical mutual aid rather than symbolic solidarity action instead of rhetoric. Thursday night, they drove to Moline, Marcus and Carolyn in the F-150, Ray and Claire following in their own vehicle. The convoy of tractors was already beginning to form along rural highways, farmers leaving fields half-finished to make the journey, because this moment felt more important than the harvests they were interrupting. Marcus watched headlights stream past in the opposite direction, machines crawling toward Illinois while his truck moved with them, and the scale of what his 4-minute video had created felt surreal. The motel was budget-level clean enough, but worn around edges that suggested it catered to travelers prioritizing function over comfort. Marcus checked them into adjacent rooms while Carolyn monitored the convoy group chat on her phone, tracking arrivals and coordinating parking. The count had reached 63 confirmed tractors, with 4 more possibles, and the organizers were already discussing overflow logistics for machines that might not fit in the designated area. Carolyn set Judith's photograph on the nightstand between the 2 beds. Marcus looked at it without comment, the familiar weight of grief complicated now by the knowledge that Judith had anticipated this moment and prepared them both for it. She had not known the specifics, the combine lockout or viral video or convoy to Moline, but she had understood that Marcus would eventually face something requiring him to be visible in ways that terrified him, and she had left instructions for how to survive that visibility without losing himself. "Dad, are you scared? Terrified? Good. That means you care about getting it right." The wisdom was Judith's passed through their daughter in words that probably came from some conversation Marcus had not been present for, mother preparing daughter to help father through challenges that seemed distant when spoken aloud, but were always approaching whether or not anyone acknowledged them. He wondered how many other instructions Judith had left, how many automated emails and hidden letters and strategic preparations were waiting to deploy at moments of maximum need. They slept poorly, Marcus, because his mind would not stop calculating harvest timelines, and Carolyn because she kept checking her phone for updates from the convoy arrivals. By 5:30 Friday morning, both were awake, dressing in the dark and preparing for a day neither fully understood how to navigate. The tractors began gathering at dawn. Marcus and Carolyn drove to the John Deere regional office on East Moline Boulevard to find parking lots already filling with green and yellow machines, farmers standing beside them drinking coffee from thermoses and speaking in low voices about weather back home and crops still waiting, and the shared frustration that had pulled them away from work to stand together in a corporate parking lot. The scene was more surreal in daylight. 67 pieces of heavy equipment, arranged with deliberate spacing to maximize visual impact while maintaining order. Pickup trucks mixed among the tractors, farm wives emerging with folding tables and coffee urns and boxes of homemade pastries. Claire organized the coffee station with military efficiency, directing placement and establishing a serving rotation so no one person bore the entire burden. Carolyn helped set up while Marcus walked among the machines, nodding to farmers he recognized from cooperative meetings and county extension programs. The gathering felt less like a protest and more like a reunion, people connected by shared experience rather than ideology. A journalist from Chicago arrived at 7:40, followed by crews from Des Moines and St. Louis. They set up cameras at the perimeter, capturing images of tractors and families and children brought by grandparents who wanted them to witness something historic. One reporter approached Marcus asking if this was about corporate control of agriculture. Marcus chose his words carefully. "This is about being able to use the machine I paid for when my crop is ready. Nothing more complicated than that." The simplicity seemed to confuse the reporter, who had been expecting rhetoric about monopolies and exploitation, but Marcus had no interest in performing outrage. His complaint was specific and his need was immediate and complicating. The message with broader political arguments would only dilute the clarity that had made the video resonate in the first place. Rebecca Walsh emerged from the building at 9:17. She was 28. White-dressed in business casual that marked her as administrative rather than executive level. Her employee badge identified her as regional customer service, and the fact that she walked directly toward the gathering rather than observing from windows suggested she had made a decision that might cost her professionally. She stopped in front of Carolyn rather than Marcus, and her first words were not corporate talking points. "Are you Carolyn Webb?" "Yes, I read your mom's letter. Someone posted it online last night. I lost my mom when I was 24. I understand what you're trying to do here." Carolyn's eyes widened, surprise mixed with recognition that grief creates unexpected connections between strangers. Rebecca turned to Marcus, her expression shifting to something between sympathy and determination. "Mr. Webb, I'm not supposed to be out here, but I am, because this matters more than my job security. I read your service file. I've seen the delay patterns across the region, and I'm going to make some calls that I'm probably not authorized to make." She walked back into the building, and Marcus stood watching the door close behind her, uncertain whether to feel hope or skepticism. Employees breaking ranks happened in movies more often than real life. But Rebecca had referenced the letter, which meant she had followed the story deeply enough to find materials Carolyn had shared in grief support communities online. That level of engagement suggested genuine commitment rather than performative solidarity. The pressure intensified through the morning. Catherine Holloway arrived at 10:15 with formal legal notice ready for delivery, documentation thick enough to communicate seriousness without becoming unwieldy. She found Marcus among the tractors and explained that the filing cited systematic service delays as anti-competitive behavior designed to protect dealer revenue streams, with his records forming the evidentiary foundation. The notice requested immediate restoration of his equipment functionality and indicated intent to pursue class action status on behalf of the 214 farmers who had come forward with similar experiences. At 10:32, a tweet appeared from Senator Patricia Dolan, representing Iowa's agricultural districts and known for responding quickly to constituent complaints that gained media traction. Aware of situation in Moline, 67 farmers shouldn't need to leave their fields to get equipment unlocked, calling for immediate restoration of Mr. Webb's combine and full review of remote lockout policies. American farmers deserve better. The tweet accumulated 15,000 retweets within 8 minutes. Other elected officials added their voices, senators and representatives from farm states issuing statements that ranged from measured concern to explicit condemnation of corporate overreach. The story had escaped regional containment, becoming national news through the amplification machinery that transforms local grievances into political leverage when circumstances align correctly. Marcus felt exposed in ways that transcended physical visibility. The attention was not just on his combine or his documentation, but on his widowhood, his relationship with Carolyn, the letters Judith had written, and the promises he was trying to keep. Strangers discussed his grief in comment sections and news analysis segments, debating whether emotional appeals strengthened or weakened the underlying policy arguments. He had become a symbol, and symbols existed to be interpreted rather than understood, and the gap between who he was and who people needed him to represent kept widening. Ray found him standing alone near the back row of tractors, staring at nothing in particular while the gathering continued around him. "You holding up barely. That's good enough for today. Barely is enough." At 1:47, Rebecca Walsh returned. She approached Marcus directly this time, her expression revealing nothing about the outcome of whatever conversations had occurred inside the building. "Mr. Webb, they want to meet with you. 2 p.m. conference room upstairs. You can bring your attorney and 2 other people." Marcus looked toward where Carolyn stood with Claire, both women organizing food distribution for farmers who had been standing in parking lots since dawn. He thought about Ray's steady presence and Catherine's legal expertise and the folder full of documentation that had made this moment possible. "I'll be there." The 67 tractors remained in place as Marcus, Carolyn, Ray, Catherine, and Claire walked through the glass doors into air-conditioned corporate neutrality. The lobby was designed to project stability and success, surfaces clean, and lighting carefully managed to eliminate shadows that might suggest uncertainty. Marcus felt the contrast between the gathering outside and the controlled environment inside, the gap between people who worked with their hands and people who worked with systems. The elevator ride was silent. Catherine reviewed her notes, while Ray stood with the posture of someone who had spent years waiting in situations where patience mattered more than speed. Claire held Carolyn's hand, and Marcus noticed the gesture, saw his daughter accepting comfort from a woman who had known her mother, and understood the particular loneliness of losing someone who had organized your understanding of the world. The conference room occupied the southeast corner of the second-floor windows, overlooking the parking lot where tractors sat in patient rows. 3 men were already seated on the far side of the table. Stephen Hartley, regional vice president, 50-something, and carefully composed. David Park, senior attorney from headquarters, younger, but carrying himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to winning. And next to them, unexpectedly, a woman Marcus did not recognize, but whose presence shifted the dynamic in ways he could not immediately articulate. Catherine Morrison, vice president of customer relations from headquarters. 52, white, dressed in business attire that communicated authority without ostentation. She studied Marcus and his group as they took seats, her expression neutral, but her attention focused in a way that suggested she was evaluating more than just legal exposure. Catherine opened her leather portfolio and placed the formal notice on the table without preamble. She did not speak aggressively or make accusations, simply listed facts in the voice of someone presenting evidence to a jury. 14 service interactions over 3 years. Average delay during critical agricultural windows of 47 days. Cost estimates from authorized dealers averaging 3.4 times higher than independent mechanics for comparable repairs. 2 warranty denials later contradicted by third-party technical assessments. The pattern was documented across Marcus's experience and replicated in complaints from 214 farmers spanning 11 states. What happened to Mr. Webb on September 14th didn't occur in isolation. It occurred within a context of systematic service delays and pricing structures that protect dealer revenue at the expense of customer need. When you add remote lockout capability to that pattern, you transform service delays from inconvenience into economic coercion. She slid the manila folder across the table. Catherine Morrison opened it while the attorneys remained still, and Marcus watched the vice president page through records his wife had taught him to keep 4 years earlier, when grief was fresh and systems were already beginning to take advantage. The handwriting was his, but the discipline was Judith's, and every entry represented a moment when he had chosen documentation over acceptance. Stephen Hartley cleared his throat, preparing to deliver corporate response calibrated to acknowledge concern without admitting liability. His statement hit expected notes: commitment to customer service, investment in dealer networks, importance of maintaining system integrity against unauthorized modifications that could compromise safety and performance. The language was careful, vetted by legal departments, and designed to survive media scrutiny. But before Hartley could finish, Marcus leaned forward. He did not raise his voice or perform anger. He simply spoke the truth that had been building since Tuesday morning. Mr. Hartley, my wife Judith died 4 years ago from cancer. She was 48. Before she died, I promised her I would keep our farm for our daughter Carolyn. That's all I'm trying to do. Keep a promise to someone who isn't here to see whether I kept it. And your system won't let me because I chose to repair a sensor at an independent shop rather than wait 8 weeks during the narrow window when harvest has to happen. The room went silent. Carolyn reached over and took his hand, squeezing once, communicating support that steadied him enough to continue. I paid $380,000 for that machine. I followed every maintenance protocol. I kept every service appointment your dealers would schedule. And when they told me to wait 8 weeks during planting season, I made a choice to keep working instead of letting crops fail. Now I'm being punished for that choice, and 200 acres of corn are sitting in my field while weather approaches, and all I want is to finish what I promised my wife I would do. His voice did not break, but everyone in the room felt the weight beneath the words. Catherine Morrison closed the folder carefully and looked at David Park, who had been preparing legal counter-arguments, but now appeared to be reconsidering whether those arguments served the company's interests better than simply ending the situation. Catherine spoke for the first time, her voice carrying authority that superseded the regional vice president beside her. Mr. Webb, when can you get back in your field? David started to respond with qualifications and conditions, but Catherine cut him off with a gesture that left no room for debate. Before end of business today. That's when. Marcus did not blink. He had expected negotiation conditions, face-saving language that would delay resolution while maintaining corporate dignity. Instead, he received a direct answer that transformed the meeting from confrontation to conclusion. Today, yes. Today. Your restriction will be lifted within the hour. The meeting continued another 15 minutes, Catherine extracting commitments about emergency service protocols and independent repair warranty language, while Stephen Hartley and David Park tried to maintain some control over a situation that Catherine Morrison had decided to resolve through executive authority rather than prolonged litigation. But Marcus stopped tracking the details. The only thing that mattered was the word today spoken with finality by someone who had the power to make it happen and had chosen to exercise that power. They filed out of the conference room at 2:40. Catherine Morrison stopped Marcus at the door, away from the others, her voice dropping to a register meant only for him. "Mr. Webb, I have a daughter your daughter's age. What you're teaching her how to stand up, how to keep promises, even when it costs something that matters more than any policy we write or procedure we implement. Your wife would be proud of what you've done here." Marcus felt his eyes burn. He nodded because speaking would have broken him, and Catherine understood, touching his shoulder briefly before returning to the conference room where attorneys would spend the afternoon drafting language that protected the company while acknowledging they had pushed too hard. Outside, the gathering had grown. More farmers had arrived after finishing morning field work, and the tractor count had reached 71. Dylan Cross stood on a pickup tailgate coordinating with media, and when he saw Marcus emerge from the building, he raised one hand in question. Marcus held up his phone, showing the text message notification that had just arrived, but which he had not yet opened. He tapped the screen. "Equipment restriction under review. Technical team notified. Update to follow within 24 hours. Not the immediate confirmation he had hoped for, but acknowledgement that the wheels were turning. He showed the screen to Dylan and the gathered farmers. Nods and handshakes followed, people recognizing that the meeting had shifted something, even if full resolution remained pending. Engines started one by one, tractors pulling out of parking spaces and heading toward highways that would return them to their own fields and their own harvests. The convoy dissolved as efficiently as it had formed, participants returning to work with the understanding that visibility had mattered and might matter again, but was not sustainable as permanent condition. Carolyn hugged Marcus in the parking lot while cameras captured the moment for evening news broadcasts. Claire organized cleanup of the coffee station, and Rebecca Walsh watched from the building entrance, her expression suggesting she understood she had made choices today that would complicate her employment, but felt necessary anyway. Marcus and Carolyn drove back toward Iowa through afternoon light that seemed brighter than it had been that morning, the weight of attention beginning to lift even as consequences remained unclear. The combine was not yet unlocked, but progress had been made. Commitments extracted, and 240 acres still needed harvesting with rain. Still forecast, but maybe, just maybe, there would be enough time. The drive back to Iowa happened mostly in silence, Marcus gripping the steering wheel while Carolyn monitored weather radar on her phone and watched the last light drain from the western sky. They passed tractors heading home on flatbed trailers, farmers returning to interrupted harvests with the knowledge that one man's restriction had been addressed, but the broader system remained unchanged. The victory felt incomplete, necessary but insufficient, like treating symptoms while ignoring disease. Traffic thinned as they left the Illinois manufacturing corridor and entered agricultural flatlands that stretched toward horizons too distant to see in darkness. Marcus kept the truck at exactly 62 miles per hour, cruise control engaged, mind calculating harvest timelines that depended on weather cooperation he could not control. 240 acres remained. Weather forecast showed rain arriving late Sunday, possibly Monday morning if the front accelerated. He needed 3 full days of combining under ideal conditions, and he had maybe that much time if equipment worked and nothing else went wrong. Carolyn's phone buzzed at 9:47. She glanced at the screen, and her posture changed, tension releasing from shoulders that had been carrying weight since Tuesday morning. She turned the phone toward Marcus so he could read the message while maintaining focus on the road. Equipment operational status restored as of 9:43 p.m. Central. All restrictions removed, diagnostic codes cleared, remote monitoring suspended per customer request. Thank you for your patience during this service interaction. Marcus exhaled slowly, a breath he had been holding since the combine stopped 4 days earlier. The relief was physical tension draining from muscles that had been locked in preparation for continued crisis. But celebration felt premature. The restriction was lifted, but the crop remained unharvested, and time was still running, and until corn was in bins and bins were sold, nothing was actually secure. "Dad, you did it. We did it. You, me, Ray Claire Catherine, your mom." Carolyn was quiet for several miles, headlights from oncoming traffic illuminating her face in intervals that revealed she was working through thoughts she had not yet organized into words. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the particular uncertainty of someone asking questions they were not sure they wanted answered. "I never understood why Mom made you write everything down. All those years she kept telling you to document every phone call, every service appointment, every cost. It seemed excessive to me." Marcus considered how to explain something Judith had understood instinctively, but he had only learned through necessity. The documentation had never been about distrust of individuals, but recognition that systems operated according to incentives that did not prioritize customer welfare, and the only defense against systematic neglect was systematic record-keeping. It wasn't excessive, it was control. When your mom was losing control of her body, when the cancer kept spreading no matter what treatments we tried, she needed something she could still manage. Teaching me to document everything, making sure I wrote down names and dates and exact words people used, that was her way of still protecting us, even though she knew she wouldn't be here to fight these battles herself. Understanding dawned across Carolyn's features, realization that the folder had been more than business records. It had been Judith's final act of caregiving, a system designed to function after she was gone. Instructions preserved through paper and discipline for situations she would never witness, but could anticipate. She was protecting you, protecting us, even when she knew she was dying, especially then. Carolyn started crying quiet tears that she did not try to hide or explain. Marcus reached over and took her hand, and they drove that way for 20 miles, connected through grief that had been private for too long, and was finally becoming something they could share without one of them having to pretend strength they did not feel. "I miss her, Dad. I miss her every single day, and I don't know how to stop missing her." "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." The farmhouse appeared dark against darker sky when they pulled into the driveway past midnight. Marcus cut the engine and they sat in silence, neither moving to open doors, both aware that stepping out meant beginning the work that would fill the next 3 days without pause. The house felt emptier after being away, absence more pronounced after brief escape, and Marcus hesitated with his hand on the door handle. "You don't have to stay, Caro. You have work Monday. You've already taken Friday off. This will be 3 more days minimum, maybe 4 if weather doesn't cooperate." Carolyn turned in her seat to face him directly, her expression resolute in the dashboard light. "I'm staying through harvest. Non-negotiable. The job market is tight right now. You can't just keep taking time off." "Dad," I said, "non-negotiable. Mom would have stayed. I'm staying." The shift in their relationship was complete. They were no longer parent and child operating according to old patterns of authority and deference. They were partners, equals, choosing to face crisis together because facing it separately had stopped working years ago. Marcus nodded once, accepting her decision, because arguing would insult the autonomy she had claimed, and he needed to respect. They unloaded bags in darkness, and Marcus unlocked the front door to find everything exactly as they had left it Thursday morning. The manila folder still sat on the kitchen table. Coffee cups waited in the sink. Time had paused here while elsewhere it had accelerated viral videos and convoy gatherings and corporate meetings, compressing days into hours of consequence that would take months to fully process. Carolyn made grilled cheese sandwiches at 12:30 because neither had eaten since the coffee and pastries Claire provided in Moline. They ate standing at the counter, too tired for proper meals but needing calories that would fuel the work beginning at dawn. Marcus checked weather one more time before sleep. The forecast had shifted slightly. Rain Sunday night with 70% confidence, possibly extending through Tuesday if the system stalled over eastern Iowa. 3 days maximum to finish, probably less. Saturday morning arrived with frost heavy enough to delay field work until 9. Marcus used the extra hours to service the combine, checking belts and bearings and fluid levels with the methodical attention his father had taught him and his father's father had practiced before modern equipment made farming less about mechanical knowledge and more about managing computer systems that could be disabled remotely. Carolyn appeared at 7, carrying coffee and wearing jeans and boots that looked simultaneously too clean and entirely appropriate for someone learning to work equipment she had avoided her entire adult life. "Teach me how to run the grain truck." Marcus looked at her, searching for hesitation or obligation, finding only determination that reminded him so forcefully of Judith that he had to turn away to maintain composure. Judith had never wanted Carolyn to farm. She had encouraged their daughter toward education and careers that did not depend on weather or commodity prices or the physical demands that wore bodies down decades before retirement age should arrive. But wanting something for your children and respecting the choices they make are different commitments, and Carolyn was choosing this moment for reasons that had nothing to do with long-term career plans and everything to do with being present when presence mattered. "Your mom never wanted you to have to farm. She wanted me to choose. This week I'm choosing this." He spent 2 hours teaching her the grain truck's systems patient, and detailed in ways that surprised them both. How to position under the combine's unloading auger, how to watch the flow and know when the truck bed was approaching capacity, how to drive with 15 tons of corn shifting in the bed, compensating for the weight distribution that made turning and braking different than empty operation. Carolyn absorbed everything with focus that suggested she understood this was about more than mechanical operation, that learning her father's work was a form of connection they had not maintained since childhood. "Your mom used to drive this truck during harvest when you were little, before we could afford to hire help. I remember. She'd let me sit on her lap and shift gears even though I was too small to reach the pedals. She made everything feel like adventure instead of work. That was her gift, making hard things feel possible." They worked through Saturday in tandem, Marcus in the combine cutting rows while Carolyn shuttled loads to the grain bins and returned for refills. The rhythm was slower than working with experienced help would have been, but Carolyn learned quickly, and Marcus discovered unexpected satisfaction in teaching someone who wanted to learn, rather than employees who saw farm labor as temporary income between better opportunities. By sunset, they had cleared 60 acres progress that would have been excellent under normal circumstances, but felt insufficient against the weather deadline advancing regardless of their effort. Ray arrived Sunday morning with fuel and mechanical assistance, Claire following with food neither Marcus nor Carolyn had thought to prepare. They worked through lunch in the field, eating sandwiches on the tailgate while Marcus calculated remaining acreage and Carolyn checked radar imagery showing the cold front building over Nebraska, with rain already falling in Omaha and Lincoln. Acceleration continued. You've got 180 acres left. If the front holds off until tonight, you finish Monday. If it doesn't, you're cutting it close." Marcus knew the math. 180 acres at his current pace meant 24 hours of combining, and they had maybe 36 hours before rain began based on the latest updates. The margin was tight but manageable if nothing broke and efficiency remained consistent. "We work until it rains, or we finish. Nothing else matters." Ray helped coordinate the final push, running errands for parts and fuel so Marcus and Carolyn could maintain continuous operation. Neighbors stopped by offering assistance without being asked, farmers who had seen the news coverage and understood that finishing this harvest mattered beyond one family's income. Dylan Cross drove 2 hours from Illinois with his combine, arriving at 2 Sunday afternoon with the offer to cut the remaining acres in parallel so Marcus could finish before weather forced stoppage. The community mobilization happened organically, coordination emerging through shared understanding rather than explicit organization. By 3 o'clock Sunday afternoon, 5 combines were working Marcus's field in synchronized passes headers, moving through corn while grain trucks shuttled loads in rotation. Marcus watched from his cab as neighbors harvested his crop without expectation of payment, driven by the knowledge that farming existed as collective enterprise despite modern equipment's promise of individual self-sufficiency. Carolyn coordinated the truck movements, learning logistics in real time, while Claire managed food distribution for workers who had interrupted their own schedules to help someone they barely knew but recognized as deserving support. The scene resembled barn raisings from earlier agricultural eras. Communal effort mobilized when one family faced crisis that threatened their survival. Marcus had isolated himself for 4 years after Judith died, refusing help and assuming he needed to manage everything alone. Now help arrived regardless of whether he asked, and the lesson was uncomfortable and necessary in equal measure. The sky darkened at 6:30, clouds building from the west with the particular density that preceded sustained rainfall. Wind shifted direction and temperature dropped 7 degrees in 15 minutes, atmospheric changes that signaled the front's arrival. Marcus checked his monitor. 43 acres remaining. Dylan and the other farmers pushed their machines harder, increasing ground speed beyond optimal efficiency because finishing mattered more than maximizing yield on the final loads. Lightning flickered on the horizon at 7:15 Monday morning. They had worked through the night, rotating operators to maintain continuous harvest under floodlights that Ray and neighbors had rigged from portable generators. Thunder followed, distant but approaching, the sound carrying across flat farmland without obstacles to diminish its warning. Marcus calculated constantly acres versus time versus weather probability, the math growing tighter with each passing minute. 28 acres left. 18. 12. The first drops hit his windshield at 1:47 Monday afternoon, sporadic impacts that marked the leading edge of precipitation that would intensify over hours into days. The combines continued working, farmers accepting that finishing meant harvesting in conditions that were not ideal, but were still functional. 8 acres, 5, 3. Carolyn sat in the grain truck watching rain increase from scattered drops to steady drizzle, praying in ways she had not prayed since her mother's final weeks, when hope became desperate, bargaining with forces that did not negotiate. The combines moved through corn that was getting wetter with each row, moisture levels climbing as rain-soaked stalks and kernels quality deteriorating in real time, but harvest continuing because stopping meant crop loss that would exceed the value degradation from wet combining. The final header full was cut at 2:31 Monday afternoon, Dylan's machine finishing the last partial row before turning toward the shed where equipment would be stored until next season. Marcus shut down his combine and sat motionless in the cab while rain hammered the roof, the sound nearly deafening in the enclosed space. 240 acres harvested. 4 days of maximum effort compressed into 3.5 through community support and weather cooperation that had held just long enough. The margin between success and failure measured in minutes, not hours, and the closeness of the outcome made the victory feel more precarious than triumphant. Carolyn climbed into the combine cab through rain that was approaching downpour intensity. She sat in the buddy seat she had occupied as a child during rides with her mother, wet and exhausted and crying with relief that had nothing to do with crop yields and everything to do with promises kept against probability. Marcus turned to look at her and saw Judith and their daughter's features, the same determination and the same capacity for tears that came not from weakness, but from feeling things too deeply to contain. She pulled Judith's photograph from her jacket pocket, the plastic sleeve protecting it from moisture. They sat together holding the image while rain turned the windshield into flowing water, making the world outside invisible and the space inside the cab into something private and sacred. "We did it, Dad. You kept your promise to her. Couldn't have done it without you, Caro, without any of them. But especially you. She was here, Dad, the whole time. In the letters, in the documentation system, in everything she taught us about not facing hard things alone. She's still protecting us." They stayed in the cab for 20 minutes, crying and talking and grieving together properly for the first time since the funeral 4 years earlier. The rain provided cover sound and motion that made their tears invisible to anyone who might have been watching. And Marcus understood that this moment was what Judith had been preparing them for through automated letters and documentation discipline and instructions to let people help. Not the harvest itself, but the healing that could happen when two people stopped pretending they were handling grief adequately and admitted they had both been failing separately at something they might manage together. The celebration that evening happened at the farmhouse potluck organized by Claire with efficiency that suggested she had been planning it since the convoy disbanded Friday afternoon. Farmers who had helped with the final harvest arrived with their families, and the kitchen filled with food and conversation, and the particular satisfaction that comes from communal effort that succeeded against deadline pressure. Dylan drove back to Illinois that night, but stopped first to shake Marcus's hand and exchange the wordless acknowledgement men use when gratitude runs too deep for language. Claire brought pie made from Judith's recipe, and when she set it on the counter, her eyes were wet. She gave me this recipe before she died, said I'd know when to use it. The pie was perfect, crust flaky and filling balanced between tart and sweet, and eating it felt like conversation with someone who was gone, but whose presence remained embedded in objects and recipes and the small kindnesses she had distributed to people who would remember her through acts of care that outlasted her physical existence. Neighbors shared Judith's stories, moments when she had organized meals during someone's surgery, or sent encouragement when farms struggled, or simply known when help was needed before anyone asked. Marcus learned that his wife's legacy extended further than he had understood, that the community she had built was larger and more interconnected than he had recognized while she was alive. Carolyn cleaned up after everyone left washing dishes while Marcus put away food containers. They moved around the kitchen with coordination that came from shared purpose, and when Carolyn opened the manila folder to return it to its place in the filing cabinet, an envelope fell out that neither had noticed before. White, unmarked except for 3 words in Judith's handwriting. For Carolyn, your inheritance. Carolyn picked it up slowly, recognition dawning that her mother had staged one more reveal, one more piece of guidance, time to arrive precisely when it would matter most. She opened the envelope, carefully pulling out papers that Marcus recognized as legal documents but could not immediately identify. The first page was a property deed official and notarized transferring ownership of the farm from Marcus and Judith Webb jointly to Carolyn Webb individually. The transfer had been executed in February 2022, 1 month before Judith died, and had been waiting in the folder ever since for the moment when Carolyn would need to know that her mother had given her not obligations, but choices. A note was paper-clipped to the deed, Judith's handwriting filling a single page with instructions that doubled as love letter. Carolyn, this farm is yours. Not to trap you into a life you didn't choose, but to free you to choose whatever life you want, knowing you have a foundation that can't be taken away. You can farm it, you can sell it, you can rent it out and live anywhere you want. The choice is entirely yours, and no choice is wrong as long as it's what you want, not what you think I wanted or your father needs. But whatever you choose, you'll always have this. Always have a place that's home. Always have ground under your feet that belongs to you. I love you more than words can hold. Make choices that make you happy. That's all I ever wanted for you. Mom. Carolyn broke down, completely sobbing with the kind of grief that comes when you realize someone loved you enough to give you freedom instead of expectations. Marcus held her while she cried, both of them processing the fact that Judith had been planning for this moment years in advance, arranging their futures with the same careful attention she had brought to organizing community support and teaching documentation discipline. She gave me the choice. She didn't want me to feel obligated. That was always what she wanted for you, freedom to decide your own path. Carolyn pulled back and looked at her father, tears still streaming but voice steady. Dad, I want to keep it, not to farm full time, but to keep, for us, for her memory, for the next time we need ground under our feet that belongs to us, then we keep it, together. 18 months later, in March 2028, Catherine Holloway finalized the class action settlement. 214 farmers across 11 states received compensation totaling $23 million, with Marcus as lead plaintiff receiving $127,000. More importantly, John Deere agreed to policy changes, remote lockout restrictions, requiring regional approval during critical seasons, 72-hour emergency service guarantees, and clarified independent repair warranty language. The changes were incremental rather than revolutionary, but they established precedent and created accountability, where none had existed. Marcus split his settlement. Half went to Carolyn's future. Half established the Judith Webb Memorial Scholarship for children of farmers pursuing any field because Judith had believed education meant choices and choices meant freedom. The first year awarded $40,000 to 6 students. By year 3, additional donations from farmers who saw the settlement as validation brought the fund to $93,000, supporting 16 students. Claire's Farmers' Wives documentation network grew to 380 members across 12 states, teaching systematic record-keeping through app-based tools that aggregated data and identified patterns. Carolyn helped develop the technology while maintaining her Des Moines position through remote work arrangements, spending 3 days weekly in the city and 4 helping Marcus with farm management. The partnership satisfied both their needs, her career ambitions, and his operational requirements, while keeping them connected in ways that honored Judith's wish that they not face challenges alone. September 14, 2028, arrived with weather that mirrored conditions 2 years earlier. Marcus was in the field by dawn, running the same combine, now permanently disconnected from remote monitoring per settlement terms. Carolyn drove the grain truck, her skill polished through 2 seasons of practice. They worked in rhythm that required minimal communication, the efficiency of people who had learned each other's patterns through repetition and mutual respect. Lunch break found them sitting on the truck's tailgate eating sandwiches Claire had dropped off that morning, looking across acres that were half-finished and would be completed easily before any weather threat materialized. Carolyn had been building toward a conversation for weeks, and the anniversary provided the opening she needed. "Dad, I've been meaning to tell you something. I met someone." Marcus felt the familiar compression in his chest, fear of losing his daughter mixed with joy that she had found connection he could not provide. He set down his sandwich and gave her full attention. "Tell me about him. His name is Robert. He's an accountant in Des Moines. We met at a conference 6 months ago. He understands farm life because his grandfather farmed in Missouri. He respects that I spend time here. He's kind, Dad, really kind, and patient. And he makes me happy in ways I didn't think I could be after losing Mom." Marcus felt Judith's absence, acutely knowledge that his wife would never meet Robert or plan wedding details if marriage became relevant. But beneath grief was genuine happiness. "Your mom would want you happy. That's all she ever wanted." "I know. That's why I'm telling you. I am happy, Dad. For the first time since she died, I'm actually happy instead of just functional." They finished lunch in comfortable silence, and Marcus marveled at how far their relationship had traveled since the morning the combine stopped. Crisis had transformed polite strangers into partners who could discuss difficult emotions without retreating into protective distance. That evening they drove to the cemetery on Oskaloosa's south edge. Judith's headstone had a new bronze plaque below the original engraving. Judith Webb, 1974 to 2022. Wife, mother, teacher. Write it down. Stand up. Let people help. They sat on grass facing the marker, watching sunset paint the sky. Carolyn spoke first. "Mom, we did it. Kept the farm. Helped other people. Did it together instead of alone. Everything you taught us." Marcus added his simpler message. "Thank you for teaching me, both of you. Thank you for not letting me disappear." They stayed until darkness made headstones invisible. On the drive home, Marcus thought about scholarship recipients studying engineering and nursing and education because Judith believed children deserved choices. About the documentation network teaching farmers to prove what happened to them. About Carolyn building a life that included but was not limited to farming. Exercising freedom her mother had given through property deeds and permission. The video had crossed 2 million views and continued accumulating slowly. Comments still appeared monthly, farmers describing lockout experiences and thanking Marcus for visibility. But viral moment had passed, replaced by sustained advocacy that mattered more than temporary attention. Catherine's firm was litigating 3 additional cases using precedent Marcus's settlement established. State legislatures were considering right-to-repair bills restricting remote lockouts. None of the changes were revolutionary. System transformation happened slowly when it happened at all, but incremental progress accumulated into meaningful difference, and the combination of documentation, discipline, legal advocacy, and community organizing created infrastructure supporting future challenges. The strongest thing any of us can do is admit we can't do everything alone and let people love us enough to help carry what we cannot manage ourselves. Marcus had learned that. Carolyn had learned that. And maybe, just maybe, that was the legacy Judith had been trying to create all along. Not perfect solutions, but sustainable support. Not isolated strength, but connected resilience. Not silence in the face of systems that did not care, but documentation that proved you mattered enough to stand up when standing up was hard. They pulled into the driveway as full darkness settled. Marcus cut the engine, and they sat without moving, both aware this moment marked something worth acknowledging. 2 years since the combine locked. 2 years since a 4-minute video transformed private struggle into public advocacy. 2 years since father and daughter began rebuilding what grief had nearly destroyed. The problem had been solved. The crop was in. The settlement was finalized. But more importantly, Marcus was no longer alone. Carolyn had found her path, and Judith's wisdom continued protecting them both through systems she had built, knowing she would not be there to operate them herself. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything.